Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. This is the fourth in the series of learning sessions that we have around the Town Centre Action Plan. You might remember whenever the pandemic first struck, the Cabinet Secretary at the time, Aileen Campbell, had asked Professor Lee Sparks and a wide body of people to refresh the Town Centre vision. So that was published in February 2021. A new future for Scotland's towns. Since that, we've been working with Scottish Government and various departments and stakeholders to try and fine-tune the recommendations to see what could be deliverable ambitiously in terms of post-pandemic climate emergency type landscape. And we've been using these sessions to try and inform all of that emerging policy. Pleased to say that it is moving ahead with pace, and the new Town Centre Action Plan should be formally launched next month. So we've got that to look forward to, and I think it's important that we've got a framework, given all of the resources and investment towards town and city centres at the minute, in terms of short-term recovery, but also long-term repurposing and repositioning our town and cities in terms of repopulation, net zero, thinking about the post-pandemic environment and how retail has changed, etc. So it's a time of opportunity, and having the Town Centre Action Plan Mark II as a guiding framework, particularly given that we've got forthcoming elections in May and a lot of new intake in terms of elected members, it will be useful to have that strategic framework and guidance in terms of giving people encouragement to start doing things differently. So our first session that we had was on 20-minute neighbourhoods. The second session was on place delivery models. The third was on the MPF4, and today is the fourth session, which is on climate. So I think it's really important, given the climate emergency and the fact that we have to move at pace around all of this, that we listen to some experts today in this field to give us a sense of what can be achieved in terms of reaching our net zero ambition and doing it in a way that actually drives economic recovery and builds in a much better economy that works for more people in terms of inclusivity, health and well-being, etc. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Emily Wadsworth, who's the Development Director at the Green Action Trust. And Emily's going to talk us through how we can actually deliver net zero in the context of our town and city centres. So Emily, over to you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much, Phil. Hello, everybody. I hope you can all see that screen nicely. So yes, as Phil said, I'm Emily Wadsworth. I'm Director of Development at Green Action Trust. For those of you that don't know about the Green Action Trust, you may have been familiar with an organisation called the Central Scotland Green Network Trust. That's us. We changed our name about 18 months or so ago to reflect our ambitions to move away from just working in the Central Belt, but to address all of Scotland, and particularly urban regeneration and environmental regeneration there. We deliver the CSGN still, the largest blue-green infrastructure project of its kind in Europe. And we also deliver a range of other programmes and projects that aim to regenerate, particularly urban areas, but anywhere that's targeted on disadvantaged communities. We lead the 10,000 Rain Gardens for Scotland programme as well, which Rachel will be talking to you about at some point later on this afternoon. So I've been asked to talk about achieving net zero in towns and places with a particular focus on green infrastructure. But I thought I'd have a couple of context slides to hopefully make sure everyone's on the same page. Apologies, most of you probably know all this already, but just to set the scene, net zero is defined as when total greenhouse gas emissions are equal to or less than the emissions that are removed from the environment, so that we have no net gain of any form of greenhouse gas emissions. That's not just carbon, that's all of them. It can only really be achieved by using both a combination of reducing emissions and also removing emissions. It's not possible for us to continue our lives in the way we do without some form of emissions, and therefore they will need to be removed in various ways. It's acceptable that we are locked into an unavoidable amount of climate change and its associated impacts. There's a certain amount that we cannot avoid now. It's simple as that. And I know in Scotland that's been estimated at somewhere between a 1 and 3 degree warming, resulting in warmer and wetter winters, possibly up to about 20% wetter. but also hotter and drier summers, possibly even up to about 15% hotter than we have now, with an associated sea level rise of somewhere between 20 and 40 metres over the next few years. Therefore, it's important that adaptation is considered in any actions we take for net zero, as well as mitigation. We need to be able to adapt to that unavoidable climate change and what its impacts will be. Again, I'm sure most of you are aware of Scotland's climate change goals, but just in case, there's a quick recap that Scotland aims to be net zero by 2045, and that involves a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases by 75% by 2030. We've got various interim targets, in fact, we've got annual targets that you can Google and find out about, but the main interim targets are that figure of net zero, we need to be 90% by 2040. But 56% by 2020. Now we know that we'd missed the 29 target by a couple of percent. We think that we have achieved the 2020 target, but in reality that's purely down to lockdown and the fact that from March 2020 onwards there was no air flights, there was no travelling, no cars, or very few cars on the roads, meaning that there was a massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It's quite possible that that target has only been achieved due to the effects of lockdown. And as we go back to some form of normality, those emissions will increase again. We need to have a serious think about how we prevent those emissions just going back up to 2019 levels and keeping them as low as we can to help us take a real step forward in the net zero target. It's worth pointing out, because I mentioned that adaptation is as important as mitigation, that we do have Scotland's climate change adaptation plan. However, rather than being target-based, that's outcome-based. And those outcomes are focused on resilience and on community, as opposed to reduction in flooding volumes and that kind of thing. The green infrastructure, maybe tipping into the areas that you're less familiar with. The National Planning Framework 4, however, defines green infrastructure as features or spaces within the natural and built environments that provide a range of ecosystem services. Broadly, basically means an area of planting that does more than just look pretty, though that's an ecosystem service as well. And they can cover anything from native woodlands, semi-natural and ancient woodlands, ponds and other green spaces, right the way through to the built environment, which green roofs, green walls, rain gardens, roadside swales, that kind of thing. The sort of thing that's on your screen here. They have the potential to contribute towards our journey towards net zero, but at the moment, they're not a commonly used intervention, and the actual contribution they make to our journey to net zero is limited. It's not as understood in Scotland as it could be. The benefits that green infrastructure bring are multiple. I've already touched on the climate mitigation and adaptation. They usually have, the planting will allow some form of carbon sequestration, as well as other adaptation measures, such as flood mitigation, surface and stormwater management. When used on buildings, they can save energy and they can help reduce cooling impact, the impacts of cooling in the summer, but also heating in the winter. They can deliver biodiversity benefits, green space improvements if they're accessible. They can also support active travel by making routes greener and safer. They can encourage recreation and generally make a place look a bit nicer as well, so that there's an improved public perception of an area. As well as being benefits, these can be drivers as to why a local authority or a business uses green infrastructure. You don't often get more than one driver, but you will get the multiple benefits if it's delivered and done in a holistic way. As I touched on, green infrastructure does have the potential to play a really interesting role in our contribution to the net zero. But at Scotland, we don't understand quite how we don't have the quantifiable data to understand how it can do that. Some examples that I've pulled out from elsewhere is that Portland, for example, has had a green roof policy for the best part of 15 years. And they have estimated now that a green roof can reduce the energy requirement for a building of up to 12% per year, and per building that's a saving of 5 tonnes of carbon emissions. And the stormwater reduction, because they're usually linked to removing water from the combined sewer, can be as up to 56% as well. Those three things combined have made that Portland have now essentially made green roofs mandatory on both residential and commercial buildings. Green roofs have different levels of effectability depending on the climate that they're in, and so in Northern Europe the data isn't quite as in depth as that, but the estimation is that it's an energy reduction of somewhere between 4 and 7% in Northern Europe, and by using plants as opposed to traditional roofing services, you get that double whammy of emissions removal as well. So in the last few minutes I have, and I'm going to talk through very quickly some of the examples that I thought might be of interest to you from across the globe. I think I've got 4 or 5. I'm going to start off with Copenhagen. I presume probably quite a few of you know about various bits in Copenhagen, because they've had various departments of their city council working on green infrastructure through their individual drivers. So for example, they wanted to encourage, even though they've got a very good cycle culture already in Copenhagen, they wanted to encourage more people to use it for everyday journeys, and therefore wanted to look at making some of their cycle routes safer and more attractive to use. But they also had a series of flooding events, cloudbursts as they referred to them, where large areas of the city were subject to flash flooding and a lot of damage was caused. So instead of working in silos with one department trying to look at using rain gardens and nature-based solutions to look at surface water management and stormwater management, and a separate one looking at the active travel routes, they came together and saw how could they integrate the two, how could they actually make green active travel routes that also functioned as green spaces and as suds and rain gardens and vice versa. And they've created a great network of sites across the city. It's well worth a visit if you get out of there, and if you can get out there. And it's interesting to see how the different departments in the councils are actually talking to each other and working effectively together nowadays. Philadelphia is another one. It's fairly similar to Portland in that it's been encouraging the use of green infrastructure for a long time. Their Green City Clean Waters initiative started in around about 2011, I think it was. But they actually took the decision to make it to give financial incentives to commercial properties that used green infrastructure, particularly green roofs. So you got a percentage decrease in your water bill for every square metre of green roof you had on your property. And that turned out to be so successful that it's grown and it's built from there. And now there's a citywide green infrastructure plan that delivers a whole range of benefits, including economic and environmental ones. You name it, they've got it all linked together under the one plan. They've got a lot of play involved in there, and they get art and voluntary projects up and running as well. It's a great place to go and visit. It was a brave step by the water department to do that, but once they'd taken the step, everything just spiraled from there, and they found that it actually became really easy to get people to deliver green infrastructure for green infrastructure's sake. I'll quickly touch on Vienna, the smart city framework. This is another one that's been kicking around for a few years, and it came out of the awareness by the council that the population changes within Vienna itself were different to what they expected. They'd had quite a large amount of depopulation, and then people were starting to come back into the city, and they recognised that they needed to therefore regenerate the urban area in a way to make it sustainably fit for the future. And they took a holistic view of the whole of city, piloting it in a couple of areas, but it's now been rolled out to the whole city, where they have developed these fantastic welcoming, friendly places, lots of green infrastructure. Active travel is absolutely key. They actually put the active travel networks in before they finished renovating, rebuilding the houses, so that the facilities there for people were already there when they arrived. As I say here, it wasn't explicitly driven by climate change actions. This all started sort of before the climate emergency was really announced. It was a social driver that got this going. but the way it's been done, they've recognised that they've almost accidentally delivered a whole range of climate actions on top of that, and got some of the other multiple benefits that I mentioned earlier. And I believe last year Vienna was voted the nicest place to live, or something like that. So they're obviously doing quite well. Some of you have probably heard about some of the things that are going on in Manchester. I can't even begin to explain everything that they're doing down there. And as somebody from Yorkshire, it pains me to speak well of Manchester, but they're doing some great stuff. The Greater Manchester Green City is basically an umbrella name, I suppose, for loads of different green projects and green interventions that are going on, not just in the city, but out in the Greater Manchester area as well. And it ranges from everything from the biodiversity, so it's Nature Greater Manchester, active travel projects, there's a local energy market, you can get grants for green homes, they're looking at holistic habitat and peatland restoration in the outside of the area as well to help with the flood risk management. There's an awful lot going on there. The Ignition project is probably one that you've heard of. They're part of a couple of EU-funded research grants that allow them to undertake some of these projects and properly monitor and evaluate them to see what the quantification of the benefits they deliver are. I definitely recommend going on and having a look at their website and spending most of the day probably perusing through the different things they've got going. There's probably quite a lot that Scotland can learn from what's going on in Manchester in particular. And before I run out of time, which is probably about a minute ago, there are a couple of other things that I don't have time to talk about, but if you've got time to Google, worth having a look. The picture here is the Bosco Verticale in Milan, which has probably been around for about 10 years or so, well, since it was initially designed. And I think it was initially designed and everyone thought, oh, that was a great picture, it's never actually going to happen. Well, it has actually happened. And it's happened long enough ago that they've got some really good monitoring and evaluation data on how successful it's been for all of its different benefits. Tokyo have also got a policy of creating rooftop city farms, so not just green roofs, but actually growing food on the roofs as well. There's the New Look High Line that you've probably all heard of. I'm sure there are parallels to various disused railways and things like that in Scotland. Glasgow Stalled Spaces is a project that looks at regenerating vacant and derelict land, particularly for the purposes of food growing. That's very similar to a project that underwent in Cleveland, which was called the Vacant to Vibrant project. And that's quite inspiring. When you look at aerial photographs of how Cleveland have changed over the last 40 years, it's absolutely fantastic. London has one or two things on the go at the moment. The London Plan is very focused on green spaces and green infrastructure and their contribution to climate change adaptation in particular, so much so that they've developed a living roof policy and the London Living Landscapes project, which looks at large-scale nature-based solutions. Finally, Malmo and Oslo have both got some fantastic examples of rain gardens and waterfront regeneration, usually taking fairly dilapidated areas and regenerating them using vacant and derelict land to create really exciting, great places to live using a little bit of imagination. And as I'm about to run out of time, I will stop there.
That's great. Thanks very much, Emily. I'm really heartened to hear that the War of the Roses is still raging on strong down in Yorkshire and Lancashire. But I think the important message there is traditionally we've always looked at infrastructure as being a driver of economic growth. Now we need to sort of look at a combination of green and blue infrastructure as the main driver. And the simplicity in a lot of all of that is we've already got roofs and walls and gardens, and so it's almost tweaking what's there and sort of working with what we've already got and just taking a different slant. And I don't see how we can argue against that, because all of the benefits are not just immediate. As we get warmer and wetter, you know, we have to deal with flood risk, etc. We have to deal with warmer temperatures, but tree canopies, green walls and roofs, these are all going to make the area more investable. They're going to deal with health and well-being agenda, and things like pop-up parks or urban parks and biodiversity is just, it really is a no-brainer all around. So not only are we investing in climate actions, we're also just investing in our future and the health and well-being of our economy, etc., and our people. So I really appreciate that. And I didn't mention that Green Action Trust are actually the official charity partner of Scotland's Towns Partnership this year.
Did I?
And we will be looking to do a lot of work together to try and get this message and these activities out and about and happening over the next year, happening in our towns, to give people confidence that this is the right thing to do. So thanks very much for that, Emily. We're now going to move on to hear from Fiona Ogilvie, who's a public health consultant working for Transport Scotland. And Fiona's going to tell us a bit about the car use reduction route map. So without further ado, Flora, can we pass over to you, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Can I just check you can see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk about our car use reduction route map, which was published in January. I'm going to cover a little bit about why we developed the route map, how we developed the route map, and some of the next steps. So our car use reduction route map stems from our commitment within the climate change plan to reduce car kilometres in Scotland by 20% by 2030 from a 2019 baseline. And in January this year, we published our route map setting out how we're going to do that in conjunction with COSLA. And we've centred this around 4 behaviours, and the actions in the route map support people to take these 4 behaviours in terms of reducing their need to travel, helping them to live well locally, helping them to switch to other modes of transport, and then helping them to combine or share trips where car use is still necessary. Sorry, I'm using a different computer and I've now got my slides stuck. Apologies. There we go, sorry. So a little bit of background just in terms of what we know about car use and how this prompted us to set out our route map in this way. So we know that the majority of the population live in urban areas or small towns. We know that car is currently the most dominant mode of travel, but it's also really important to recognise that not everybody has access to a car and that there are particular inequalities in who has access to a car. And we therefore wanted a route map that didn't disadvantage anybody, but also made sure that the benefits of reducing car use were more equally shared amongst the whole population. We also looked at trip types, and we know that commuting, shopping and leisure are some of the biggest contributors to that overall car kilometre picture, and also that a small proportion of longer journeys actually account for a disproportionate amount of those car kilometres travelled. So it's important that we don't just have a route map that looks at how people can change their behaviours in those urban settings, but also people living in more rural and island communities as well. And just to reinforce at this point that our target for 20% reduction is not for all individuals to reduce their car use by that equal 20%. It's for a national 20% reduction, and for those who are able to do more while protecting the needs of people, including those who use their car as a mobility aid, to still continue to use their car. So why do we need to reduce car use? Well, modelling shows that technological solutions will not be enough to meet our commitment to net zero by 2040. We need to reduce the use of private vehicles as well as switching remaining trips to lower emission vehicles. And this is in line with the wider priorities set out in our national transport strategy. And why we need to change in terms of impact on our lives. And I think this resonates quite well with what Emily was talking about in terms of a lot of the co-benefits. So our target to reduce car kilometres comes from that place of climate change and needing to take action on net zero. But reducing car use will have a huge number of other benefits in terms of air quality, road collisions, physical activity, noise, reducing community severance, helping to boost local economies, which is particularly important in the town centre context. And across all of these, it's really important to remember that all of these negative impacts of the status quo disproportionately affect some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So this is just to make the point that taking climate action isn't just about switching from our current share of different modes to electric vehicles, but it's about actually helping people to think about how they make those travel trips in a wider variety of ways. So to develop the route map, we took a behaviour change approach. We started with that recognition that people's individual behaviours are shaped by the social and material environment around them. And the interventions set out within our route map are therefore designed to support people's environments and help them to make those more sustainable choices more easy. So these are the sustainable travel behaviours that I mentioned at the beginning. So supporting people to reduce their need to travel, to live well locally, to switch modes, and to combine or share trips where they do need to use car. And it's really important to recognise that each of these different behaviours will also have a range of co-benefits. So potentially saving people time and money, helping them to connect with others, helping to revitalise local communities. And of course, they will be potentially more appropriate in different parts of Scotland for different individuals with different travel needs. So the idea really is to set out a menu of behaviours that people can choose from as is appropriate to their situation. This is an example of some of the individual interventions that are within the route map. There are over 30 interventions set out there. The route map also recognises that as we move further forward, we're likely to need to look at demand management in addition to some of these interventions. And so we have a commitment to conducting further research into potential demand management options to potentially disincentivise car use in the future. And I think one of the really important things is to emphasise just how much support there is for this type of approach. So we already know from a variety of survey data that the majority of people in Scotland think climate change is an urgent and immediate problem, that people are happy to be charged for items that are harmful to the environment where they can be replaced with more sustainable alternatives, that people say they're willing to reduce the amount that they use their personal car, and support for government to do more in this space. We've taken all that on board in developing our route map. And a big part of this is our commitment to a just transition, so to fairly moving towards net zero. And I think it's really important here to recognise the inequality in the status quo, where we have a public realm that prioritises space for people who have cars. And yet we know, as I said at the beginning, that 30% of people in Scotland don't have, or households in Scotland don't have access to a private vehicle, and that amongst the most deprived households, that rises to nearly 60%. So, and I think, again, it's important to recognise that that's not just across income, but many of the groups set out in the Equality Act are less likely to have access to a private vehicle. And so just reinforcing that message that this is about supporting an overall reduction in car kilometres whilst supporting those who do still need to use their car to do so. So that's just a really brief sort of run through of what's in our route map, the rationale behind it. We very much want to continue this conversation. Our route map is now out for consultation and we're happy for people to respond. There's also information on raising awareness around car reduction and tips for how people can start to have that conversation with friends and family, but also very keen for people to be having that conversation with colleagues and in that professional setting as well. I'm happy to take questions or for people to contact me at a later date. Thanks so much.
That was fantastic, Flora. Thank you so much. And that was a brilliant graphic, which just showed how little of the civic and public realm is given back to pedestrians, in an urban context. It's got cliff edge and everything's been given to the car. That was something that came out strong in the town centre review, that the economy and society that we've built over the last 30 years has literally just been designed around car. And so many of our citizens are not able to access that, which means they're excluded from so much of society. And I think the key recommendations coming out of TCAP are basically looking to support this change in behaviour and to reverse that sort of trend and to stop that happening, to try and build out from the core and to build in denser residential solutions and make the most of our existing urban footprint, which in turn reduces the need for a lot of travel and commuting. And COVID and climate both have combined to change how people commute and travel more widely, but we need to capitalise on that. Found that really interesting. And again, like the green and blue infrastructure interventions, the car reduction interventions have so much more collateral in terms of health and well-being and getting people more active and improving the air quality and the environment for everybody. So we will be looking forward to working with you and your colleagues moving forward much more ambitiously and trying to ensure that we're bringing these solutions down to the ground over the coming year or so. We're not going to take questions just now. We're going to go to a series of case studies. It's always very good just to look at what's happening out and about across Scotland. So we're going to hear from Peter Robinson from Scottish Canals, and then we will be able to take some questions relating to Emily, to Flora and to Peter, because Peter unfortunately has to leave us, but the North Glasgow Integrated Water Management System. Let's hear from Peter from Scottish Canals. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Phil. Can you just confirm you can see my slides?
Perfect.
Brilliant. That's all right. It's always worthwhile checking before we set off on these. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come in and talk to you about the North Glasgow Integrated Water Management System, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we call it Glasgow Smart Canal. I was out last night at the BBC Scotland for a couple of hours filming, so it's certainly something that's taken a bit of traction. But blue-green infrastructure, placemaking, quality of place, it's all tied in with the same thing. So very little brief route across some of the history and some of Scotland. So the Forth and Clyde Canal goes from the Forth to the Clyde, does what it says on the tin, and connects it to Falkirk and into Edinburgh. And I know you're going to hear from Julie shortly. So what we're talking about in Glasgow, perfectly repeatable across the canal networks. For those of you who obviously don't know about Glasgow, but you know Glasgow where Glasgow is. So it's part of the Glasgow branch of the Forth and Clyde Canal. And this project's been delivered really closely working with Glasgow City Council, Scottish Water and ourselves, looking at the requirements for the green infrastructure that can underpin development regeneration. So this slide has 4 of the 5 key development areas that are taking place and being supported by the Smart Canal project, which the development in this area would have been economically constrained if we weren't able to unlock what we've done and taken this project forward. So that the 4 red sites on there, Dundas Hill being the world's largest distillery just over 100 years ago, Site Hill, which is a transformational regeneration area, Cowles Park, Hamilton Hill. There's a 5th one, which is up at the former Ruckhill Hospital and being redeveloped. The area in the green is actually our Clay Pits Nature Reserve, which is another piece of the green infrastructure. I had some students there from Napier University a couple of weeks ago, and the deer, literally almost as if I could have planned it, the deer wandered along the path just in front of us as we were taking a lot of students from all over the world around the nature reserve. A little bit about why have we done it? So there's kind of 5 key drivers for the project. So one, clearly there's a need for development regeneration. The area of Glasgow around here, really constrained, an industrial legacy, health, well-being, health statistics really quite concerning. Male mortality in this area when we started this project, for me 12 years ago, was 54. So there's clearly some challenges around the space, and we've got evidence now that's demonstrating that we've got health and well-being benefits associated with canal regeneration. There's a need to move the surface water out of this part of Glasgow. It's up at the top. If we can't do it in a controlled way, we present a flood risk to the city centre. And we've bolted in adaptation to climate change. So we've looked at long-term climate change predictions and bolted that into the design. Another factor is developers like to develop. So developers get very nervous, certainly developing in brownfield sites. So what we've done is we've taken one of those core constraints away from them, and we've provided them with certainty. So that gives them confidence to come and develop. And you only have to go and visit North Glasgow now, and you'll see that the area is bouncing with activity. A couple of years ago, just pre-COVID, it was physically bouncing with the amount of work and engineering that was going on. And then a big one for Scottish Canals is actually diversifying the purpose. So our canals, the Forth and Clyde Canal opened in 1790 as the first C2C canal in the world. Their purpose was industrial revolution, transportation of goods and materials in a very low carbon way. But we have to make sure that to keep our canals, they have a purpose and they serve society today. What we have done with the canal, so very briefly, we've turned the operation of the canal on its head. So we take water out of 4 different reservoirs around the central belt into the lowland canals, and it's poured into the canal, and then it's wasted. So when the canal gets too full, the water is wasted. And even during 2021, we had a drought. So climate change is very real, and our assets are quite vulnerable. What we've then done is we take Met Office data, we bring it in, we run it through a model. The model looks at the scenarios of what may happen. We're bringing the surface water into the canal. If the forecast is a significant rainfall event, we effectively take the water out of the canal in advance of the rainfall, which allows and gives us the capacity to fill it back up. And we're taking the water and the surface water away. We've done it at a significantly lower cost, financial cost, than the alternative. So we've basically reused the embedded value of the infrastructure by repurposing it. So there's potentially £60 million worth of savings by having used the canal. And we've been able to then put a system in place, put some infrastructure in the ground, and set up a deal where we're able to serve the developments over 60 years. We have to make it smart. It's pretty clever. I can log into it. I can look at the temperature and water quality and other bits and pieces around Glasgow, and I'm sitting on the other side of the country. So we've put a brain on top of it, which looks at lots of different parameters around it. But the system ultimately will be autonomous. It will run itself and it will do its own thing. We can monitor it and we can override it, and we can, we have stepping rights, but the system is smart enough that it will do its own thing. It will manage all the water around this part of Glasgow. Just a little bit, because I know talking about spatial planning and bits and pieces, this is a little bit of a technical drawing that was put in place as part of the concept, which was developed and put on the table in 2013. You can see the core development sites that we've got sitting on there that I was referring to earlier. But fundamentally, we've been referring to the blue-green infrastructure. That is the layer of infrastructure that's underpinning all the development. And that is based on the concept. And you can go out and you can almost follow some of these routes. They're starting to appear on the ground. Water flows downhill. It's not complicated. So you only need a little bit of topography, and therefore you can pick up well, actually, looking back, I did pick up a blue pen and a green pen, and we effectively used, very simple techniques of sketching it on. So we've created these layers of blue-green infrastructure. Doesn't all have to be in exactly the same location on the concept. Some of it is moved, but predominantly it's all happening. We also then looked at deploying a wide range of innovative sensors that we could go further. So we've delivered this. One of my frustrations is that we've delivered maybe 30% of the potential of the concept, which was going to go much, much further, looking at water sensitive urban design and water use down to a property scale. But we haven't. We've done it at quite a large scale. But then some days I remind myself that we've done 30% of the concept. So rather than beat myself up and that we've missed an opportunity, we've grabbed one and we've delivered it. And I think on that, I was talking to us engineers in Australia in November. I went to a conference in Australia, which unfortunately was at 3 o'clock in the morning our time. And there was lots of people talking. So lots of people talking about doing things. And we caught them out because we talked about having done something. And I think that's a really important message, is that we have to start taking action. So even if it's only achieving 30% of something, 30% of something is better than nothing. So for us, it's a catalyst, and we're building on it, and it's rippling around. Just to give you an insight into some of the delivery. So this is the Clay Pits Nature Reserve. In the middle of there is a suds pond, which is part of the development infrastructure that's going to support the development of Hamilton Hill, which is then going to be connected into the canal. So the ripple goes beyond that. That's enabled us to deliver, the benefits around the Clay Pits Nature Reserve, the benefits that are happening on Site Hill. So if you are in Glasgow, or you've been along the M8 recently, you'll have seen the Site Hill Garden Bridge over the M8, which ties into Site Hill, which is being built, and the surface water's coming into the canal, which then goes up into Dundas Hill. And as part of this, we've got the blue, the green, and a little bit of grey infrastructure. So from Dundas Hill, you'll be able to get on your bike, go down, across, over the canal, along the towpath, up through Site Hill, over the Garden Bridge on the M8, and down into George Square. And I'm looking forward to the day that I'm able to do that, because I reckon you'll be able to do it probably in under 10 minutes. Might take 15 minutes to get back up the hill, but 10 minutes to get down. And I think that is going to really underpin the development of 20-minute neighbourhoods. There's clearly, 3,000 new homes that are going to be probably within a 10-minute cycle ride of Glasgow city centre. Just a little techie insight. So I can log in. This is a little bit of a dashboard just to kind of prove it. It's a little bit like a nuclear power station. So I can log in and I can look at all sorts of different parameters. Just few little bits and pieces. So defining success. So back in 2012, when I started working on this, I set out and said, there's 3 things that I would have said would be a highlight of a success of a project. So we'd had visitors from Malmo. So we heard about people going, Malmo, I'd love people to come to Glasgow and celebrate what we've got. Let's not go and visit Malmo. The infrastructure would be in place, and we would demonstrate this is cost effective. I updated this in 2018, and the only thing I changed was the date. It's taken a bit longer than I would have had ambition to do. But then In 2020, just between the two lockdowns, we had visitors from Estonia. So we had, getting people from, Europe coming and visiting us to have a look at what we did. There it is, there's the evidence. Then in 2021, we did a little bit more work and we looked at it. And so not only have we saved a huge amount of financial cost, but having taken this approach and unlocking the embedded carbon within our infrastructure, we've avoided additional carbon costs. So we've estimated that the alternative way of doing this would have been to have put in a traditionally engineered drainage solution, which would have incurred a 35,000 ton carbon equivalent cost. So it's not that we've saved it, we've just avoided spending it. So there's another benefit that came on it. And we continue to build on it. So we've planted floating ecosystems. We were lucky enough with Nature Scotland giving us a grant. So we've put floating ecosystems in the canal in the middle of Glasgow. I was there last summer, had a look. For those of you of a certain age, you probably recognize it. There were big fish, there were little fish, there were no cardboard boxes, but the place was bouncing with wildlife and just thriving in terms of habitat. So that's it. There you go. A little bit as an overview of the Smart Canal.
Yeah, Peter, thanks very much. And as an avid kayaker, I was very familiar with Scotland's canals, and certainly over the last decade or so, particularly around the likes of Falkirk with the Helix, the Wheel, but also North Glasgow. I've just noticed so much more development and opportunity. We always turned our back in Scotland, we turned our back on our blue infrastructure. If we had a river or a canal, we just didn't see anything beyond the old industrial use. But I think moving forward in terms of climate mitigation, in terms of development, leisure, transport, there's just so much more, even energy, there's so much more that can be made of the canal networks across the country. This should really be seen as key national infrastructure in terms of quite a lot of economic, social and environmental ambitions. So appreciate that. We don't seem to have any questions coming forward just now in terms of what we've heard from Emily, Flora. What we'll do then, I think, just to save everybody's afternoon, if you don't mind, Peter, if we don't have any questions just now, what we can do is we've got your contact details. If people want to pick up with you afterwards, we can forward that on to you if that's okay. And we know that you're busy and you have to head off, so appreciate
that's fine. What I'll do, I'll leave it on. I've got a few minutes. I'll leave it on. If anybody wants to pop a question in the chat, I'll answer it back before I disappear. But otherwise, thank you very much for the opportunity to come in to talk to you.
Brilliant. Lovely to meet you, and thanks for that. We're now just going to move to the next speaker, Julie Waldron, who's the Senior Landscape Planner for City of Edinburgh Council, to talk us through the Edinburgh Water Vision and the Blue and Green City Partnership. So Julie, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming.
Okay, so hopefully, as I said, I too not used to sharing this, using this particular computer. Now I seem to have, I don't seem to, that's interesting, okay. Are you getting my slides?
Yes,
you're
we
on
can
full
see them.
screen now.
Yeah, I'm on full screen. I'm ready to go. Brilliant. Okay, well, yes, thank you very much for asking me to speak. And yeah, I'm this senior planner. So I'm a landscape architect by training, and I work at the City of Edinburgh Council. And we have been trying to move forward our climate adaptation. So as you've heard before, the climate is changing. In Edinburgh in particular, we've got a risk assessment that's done. And you can see from the slides that in Edinburgh, we're looking at about 5-degree rise, potentially under one climate scenario, and at 3 degrees in the winter, 5 in the summer, so really significant. And obviously more rainfall, so you can see the red line, more rainfall in the winter, above the black line, and less rainfall in the summer. But what's really important, because we're a really urban environment, is that intensity of rainfall. So we're looking up to a 40 to 45% over the next 20 years. So when those really intense rainfall comes down and we've got just hard pavements, we get flash flooding. So what the current situation, what we've just quite recently set up in Edinburgh, is we have the Lothian Strategic Drainage Partnership, which is a board level. So you have directors from the council, the Scottish Water and SEPA, and then we have the Blue Green City Partnership, which is our working group, which I'm on with our sort of chief engineer on that. And then the Water Vision is the document that I wrote to bring it all together and make sure that we did the same thing, not only for planning applications, but for all the permitted development applications. you can see from this slide how things have really speeded up. Not only have we gone from the 1 in 200, which is the standard level of flooding that we're looking at when putting in new housing, but that's gone from 0% up to 40%. So we've got climate change rising. We've got everything actually moving. You can really see the change. We've got all of these things that have happened quite recently. We already had the Water Relief Flood Alleviation Scheme, and we already had surface water management plans for high-risk areas. But we have a very historic city, as you know, so it's an inscribed World Heritage Site, 1995. And really, in order not to damage that inscription, we have to be really, really careful about how we play around with the characteristics. And ideally, obviously the heritage people who we work with want to see no change. But obviously that's not totally possible, so we've got to work out how we can change. The big problem being that underneath our city, and same in many cities and towns, is we have combined sewer networks, and these networks are already full. So we haven't even got to climate change and they're full. And so what happens when they're full, as you can see by this slide, is they pour out raw sewage. So what we're doing in the Edinburgh World Heritage Site itself, we've just managed to get some pull together some money. We're going to do a model for the whole site to work out what is actually going to happen, what will happen, so we can auctioneer. So you can answer the questions like, do you need Princess Street Gardens to turn into the Norloch again? Hopefully not. I think everybody would get very upset, but we need to look at that. So obviously Scottish Water and SEPA have been moving forward at the same time, and Scottish Water is no more in what's in out. It talks about the combined sewers, and they have been working with SEPA, and they are now they're moving forward in a demonstrably different fashion. So moving very much to blue-green infrastructure and placemaking. Our most recent flood risk assessments, they informed our new city plan that's just gone through the system, and we used the some of the objections from the water vision. So this is the water vision. It's a very short document. I want it to be short, punchy, get it through the system, get it politically bought, buy-in, get that political buy-in with councillors. That's so important. So and as I said, with nice lots of pictures. So not too many words because everybody's extremely busy these days. But we do have these key objectives. So what, for example, on this one, support sustainable growth by taking the precautionary approach. So when we look for housing sites for the city plan, we took a precautionary approach to where to put that housing, and we had that agreed at political level, if you like, that we were able to do this. Look at this one here. This is requiring all new development to manage the first 5 millimetres of rainfall, which is something that if you were talking to Scottish Water and SEPA, I was at the Climate Emergency Conference, and there was just tremendous frustration that we didn't actually get that done in planning applications. So pop it in here, and suddenly we have movement, and we're moving now to green roofs, and we have something that isn't yet policy, because policy is coming, but it has been agreed by the politicians and have gone through committee. So it has some weight in the planning system. And this is because we were getting this end of pipe hideous craters that really annoyed me, and what we wanted to see was far more interesting landscapes like swales and ponds. And in order that people didn't have the excuse they didn't understand what we're talking about, we pulled together this project, which is the Sustainable Rainwater Management Guidance, funded by Sustrans, so thank you Sustrans, which is everything to do with SUDS, all the different aspects. It's written in such a way that it's applicable across Scotland. There's a Edinburgh central section, but all other aspects are applicable across Scotland. And it just explains sustainable urban drainage and blue-green infrastructure, the wet side of blue-green infrastructure. We also have fact sheets, which explain certain, we've got one, for example, on swales, and we've got one on suds trees, and we've got one on rain gardens. So again, these documents, because they've gone through our committee system, can now be considered in planning applications. And as I say, there's no excuse. So that's there's no excuse now for any developer coming forward, because we can just point them in the direction of this guidance. And again, this is online and available to anybody. Very please use it. It was, as I said, public money, Sustrans that put this together. So this one, ensuring a citywide approach to interconnected green-blue network, because we needed that for the local plan, but we wanted to make a green-blue network embedded in our new city plan 2030, which hopefully will be adopted in 2023. So in order to form that network, set up the Green Blue Network project, bringing together the normal green network that we had previously, plus all the blue information that we had from the strategic flood risk assessment. So we collated all of the information. So this is working with Atkins, again funded by Sustrans and various other people. I managed to put some small amounts of money in the pot. So we have our green space, our river networks, our paths, and now the ecosystem services. There was another project going in the council, Edinburgh Nature Network. We got together with them to make sure that our priority habitats, we wanted to connect the priority habitats. So that was brought into this project as well. And then Atkins also looked at air and carbon sequestration as ecosystem services. And again, bringing all of this information together, what did it give us? It gave us the areas of the city where it would be most useful to spend money. So if we look down, these were the areas that came up in Edinburgh. And if you just keep in mind area number 4, so that was information that fed to this project. And this gave us our strategic green blue network of the city. So if you like, a theoretical network that we could start working with. And then going back to the water vision, another objective was to reduce and remove stormwater from the existing combined sewer network. And this tied in beautifully with what the Scottish Government were writing, which was talking about their framework for surface water management. In other words, placemaking, the things you can hear to see at recommendation 13. So informed by a comprehensive water strategy or vision, presume no rainwater connection to the sewer, that's in the new policies, and also disconnect. And it also, the Scottish Government had put forward the draft national planning framework 4, and blue-green SUDS infrastructure was one of the national projects for Scotland. So the Blue-Green City Partnership, if you remember right back at the beginning of the, I will show you the triangle and how that sat underneath the strategic, the Edinburgh Lothian Strategic Drainage Partnership. The Blue-Green City Partnership was a working group, and this working group, so this is the Scottish Waters engineers coming up, sorry it's a bit fuzzy, but the 3 areas of the city in Edinburgh where the sewers are flooding and we have surface water issues, those are the 3 areas, and the purple one is exactly the same area that came through the other work that we were doing in the Green Blue Network project. So this area here is the area that we're going for first. So we have just had workshops on this area, and we have just recently let a contract for Atkins to do a blue-green master plan of the area. I can't show you the Scottish Water detailed modelling because we haven't had it's not a public piece of work, but basically there are certain parts in that area that we need to use to attenuate water. So we've asked them to link surface water routes and provide attenuation. We've asked them to create better links. We've asked them to link footpaths and cycleways. So basically a retrofit green blue master plan. Now this is one that I can say I did earlier because it's quite funny because I did in London, but this is when I was joking with people and saying, no, we can dig up the parts. Obviously this took years, but I mean, in essence, you can take a park and this was originally football pitches. You can create a hole, but you can turn it into a beautiful place and have footpaths and all the things that we've been looking at. So this is now a nature reserve, but it actually holds 35 Olympic swimming pools and stops Lewisham from flooding. So that's what we need to do in Craigleith. We've also, as the project jumped into other projects going on in the council, like this is an active travel project, has said, hang on a minute, can we actually take the sewer water, surface water sewer out of it while you're doing that project, while you're digging up the road anyway, can we add some more SUDS in? So we've been doing that. So our aim is to do little things and big things. So use our parks and work with the schools. That's another big stream of work, get them to disconnect their roof water and get the large retail parks. We've already had, somebody's already started to talk about that. Can we get our retail parks to do more? And then try to prevent people from paving their front gardens. So we need to remove permitted development rights in these particular water sensitive areas of the city. And we need to look at our trees, further protect our trees and plant more trees. And then we need to ask the golf course, because in this case, we actually have a golf course. Can we get the golf course to help with this one? So that's fine. I didn't want to take up too much time. So in summary, we know the climate's changing. We have our overall vision, we have our objectives, and we also have the sort of guidance now. We know where to do the work, and we've got to carefully consider our historic areas. And we've got policy for new development coming through the city plan. And we also recognise that flooding is not a science, it's a risk-based thing. But we need every planning application and every time somebody comes into Edinburgh City Council to be able to just hold back even 1 or 2 more drops of water, because overall that will create a difference and make a difference. So thank you for listening, and I hope I haven't gone over my time, so I know I had a lot of slides. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Julie. That was excellent, Julie. And I think people need to remember, it's not that long ago whenever we had flash flooding and Princess Street basically became a river. You know, very often we don't associate Edinburgh with flooding, but it was interesting to hear that, you know, how it can be retrofitted, and also lots of land that have become sterile. If we are more active around flood prevention, flood mitigation, green-blue infrastructure, that land can be brought back into productive use. So it will ultimately increase land value. And there's so much pressure on housing land in Edinburgh that could ultimately provide more opportunities. So very interesting to hear even about how parks, you know, can actually be beautified and be used in terms of sustainable urban drainage and creating actually biodiversity and beauty for larger swathes of population to benefit from. So I do appreciate that. And if you're okay to hang around, we've just got one more speaker and then we'll open up to Q&A. Alison, I think this, we're back again. Okay, so we're going to move on to our final speaker, who's Rachel Howlett. Rachel is the Rain Gardens Development Officer for the Green Action Trust. We have an ambition for 10,000 rain gardens in Scotland. Rachel, tell us how you're going to deliver that.
Sorry, Rachel, you're on mute there.
Yep.
Okay.
Just checking there that you could all hear me. And can you see my slides full screen as well?
Not yet, but it is loading.
Okay, super.
Hopefully.
I've sent a copy just in case as well. Would you like me to try and reshare if not?
That's them up now.
That's that up.
Okay.
Perfect. Wonderful. Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. So as Phil said, my name's Rachel, and I actually work with Emily at the Green Action Trust as a development officer, but I'm also a landscape architect and a teacher by training. And I'm going to talk to you about the 10,000 Rain Gardens campaign. So just a brief overview of what I'll run through. I'm aware that many of you will be aware of aspects of this, but this also just samples some of the materials that we've been using in engaging with communities and other groups who might not know as much as the experts. So I'll cover what a rain garden is, why we need them, the benefits, a bit more about the Rain Gardens for Scotland campaign, and end with a couple of case studies. So the 10,000 Rain Gardens campaign uses the definition of a rain garden as a planted area designed to hold back and slowly release rainfall. So the aim being to use designed landscape features to capture rainwater runoff and to slow its journey down to the drain or watercourse. And examples include garden planters above ground, there's an image of one there, garden plots where rain gardens are set into the ground, suds or attenuation basins, swales, ponds, pocket parks, wetlands, bog gardens, green roofs and walls. And you've seen examples of those in many of the presentations today. These can connect to form systems in the rainwater management train. Just to show you some photographs to illustrate some of these features. So in the top right of this image, you can see an experiment at the Green Action Trust office in Shotts, where we've intercepted rainwater off the roof here. We've rerouted our downpipes and we're redirecting that rainwater into planters and then into a swale and then into a little pond at the end. And that then overflows into a larger pond further back in the woodland. And that was really important to us, sort of bringing that right onto our doorstep and experimenting. Below that, you see an example of an in-ground rain garden at the Taylor Wimpy show homes, which was one of the projects where we worked with a housing developer to get some exemplar rain gardens into a development. Here you can see Malmo, which has already been mentioned, an example of a green roof. Below that, an example of a basin in Amsterdam, which is quite different in character to the large crater-like sud basins that we often see at the edges of developments where water is piped to them. To the right, you can see a pavement feature rill in Ashford, which highlights the movement of water.
I think we've lost Rachel's connection there, Phil.
Yeah, it appears that
She's dropped out, unfortunately.
Rachel's presentation killed all of her bandwidth and flooded our seminar. So do you reckon we give her a second or two to come back in to complete the presentation?
I think so. I'll just keep an eye out for her. She has dropped out of the room.
If any of the speakers are still here, I would like to just take chair's privilege and throw a question in. We all know that climate, you know, the bigger drivers that we can sort of directly intervene: transport, energy, housing. You know, we've talked a lot about those today. What about consumption? You know, we're looking at Scotland Loves Local as a programme to drive more localism. Is there something there in terms of localism being used much more aggressively to mitigate climate? Any of our speakers want to pitch in on that? I know it's a wee bit left field and it's not your area of specialism, but I just think
I've got sort of theories on because I'm particularly passionate about beauty. So if we turn our towns into beautiful places by using suds and water and interesting places, then I think people will want to stay more local. And if they stay more local because they have a really beautiful place, like for example, the Sutcliffe Park I showed you, it literally was just playing fields, and everybody travelled and went everywhere else. And when it was changed, everybody then went to Sutcliffe Park, although it had huge housing areas around. They used that. So you stay more local, you shop more local. So I think for me, that I'm particularly passionate about getting the word beauty into policy and to use the word beauty, because people are really attracted to stay in beautiful places. So I think it can have all of these knock-on effects to consumerism, because you will buy local if you are in a beautiful place, or you'll get in your car and go and drive somewhere else if you don't like your local shopping area. So that would be my word of the day.
I like it, beauty. Never usually associated with me, but I'll maybe again use chair's privilege, and thanks for that. Is anybody else? I mean, again, if you have any points around your own area of expertise, feel free to pitch in. But it's just something I'm curious about. I'd love to know how much of our climate problems are actually driven by consumerism. You know, and is there a better way to tackle that? You know, I see people consume things and throw them away, which clogs up our. I mean, the people drop stuff in Glasgow without realising that ends up in a whale's stomach. You know, out at sea, it falls down our drains, it goes into our rivers, it comes down our estuaries, out into the ocean. Is there a way of managing consumerism better, and maybe hooking into the Scotland Loves Local programme to encourage that, using things like beauty and incentives, etc.? But is there anybody smart enough to work out roughly what is the ratio split? You know, transport, housing, energy, industrial energy, consumerism. Has anybody got an idea of how much consumerism actually contributes to the carbon footprint? No.
I'm going to make a sweeping statement, but before I do, I'll just say I've just had a message from Rachel saying it's her internet's playing up, so she's going to hotspot on her phone and join in a moment. But in the meantime, I'm going to make a sweeping generalisation and say I think it plays quite a lot into that mix, and I think that it's actually a combination of what Julie was just saying about beauty, and that people don't necessarily feel like they live in beautiful places, so they don't feel the need to look after them. And we have quite a consumerism, materialistic society where it also doesn't encourage people to necessarily think about the way they're living and to look after them places themselves. And so, yeah, I think it's one of those catch-22 situations, but it's just almost like a spiral of descent.
I think it was
before I get into a soapbox.
Yeah, just coming back again. So when we did the Craig Miller Urban Design Framework, it was really interesting. So you had an area of Edinburgh where the amount of litter that people threw down was incredible, and just really quite close by, you had an area that had exactly the same housing stock, it had the same spaces, but it was looked after really, really well. And there was this contrast between the two. It always struck me whenever, because we went to knock the place down and rebuild it, etc. But it was a lot to do with the health. It was the health of the population.
Yeah.
It was incredibly obvious when you did, you know, that there was a lot of people in one area who weren't able to look after their green spaces. So therefore they became awful, and therefore it attracted litter. So you almost felt that because they weren't, it wasn't in their possibility, that you needed to step in and help more. And if you helped in that situation, then that care, that feeling of that you're caring for them, then they wouldn't drop the litter, sort of thing. I mean, I know it sounds very simplistic, but it was a striking difference with the two areas of the city, even.
Oh, listen, I'm really glad to say that Rachel has been able to hotspot in. I think Rachel's out in the real world actually meeting clients today and delivering green infrastructure. So we have to give her extra brownie points for actually being on the job and contributing to the webinar. So Alison, are you able to bring?
Yeah, I'll just bring this slide, the last one we were on, if that's okay, Rachel.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to do it.
Oh, perfect. Give Rachel as much bandwidth as possible.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Glad to have you back, Rachel.
You can hear me okay, yeah?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'll just flick to my notes where I was on that slide. So, oh wow, so I was talking for at least 2 slides before I realized. Yeah, so just to show you some photographs of some of the features. So I was talking about the experiment at our office in Shotts, where we've rerouted rainwater down the roofs of the barns there into a swale and then into a pond. And then I was saying how important that was for us to experiment on site. We could see this every day. We can see what it's doing in different weather conditions. We can then apply that to real world designs. Obviously at Green Action Trust, I work with colleagues who are also delivering green infrastructure sites, and they're adding rain gardens within their designs, you know, as everybody is who's working within landscape architecture. So having this living lab has been quite important. We've had a few issues with lockdown in that we weren't able to get there, but we're hoping to almost run like a CPD day, myself and another landscape architect, where we look at the maintenance of that and how it's fared over the last couple of years. I want to flick to the next slide. Super. Okay. So across the top there, you can see examples of roadside swales. These ones are taken from Sheffield as part of the Grey to Green scheme. And this was developed in response to severe flooding in 2007 and has been retrofitted into a former dual carriageway. And the bottom image, you may recognise it from Julie's slides, show Sutcliffe Park in London, where the River Quaggy was given space to flood across the park, and that's protecting Lewisham. On the next slide, there's just some examples of green roof shelters, which we've actually, these ones are RHS in Chelsea, but these are actually going to be installed at Queensland Court and Gardens, which is one of the case studies that I'll mention at the end. There's examples of Green Wall, Holmuddy Recycling Centre, Swales, and that's an in-ground rain garden in London at Bridget Joyce Square, designed by Robert Bray Associates. So on the next slide. So the 10,000 Rain Gardens campaign, as I mentioned, includes community engagement and engagement with the public at various events and as part of flood risk management planning events and pop-ups. And it includes leaflets which show rain gardens in use in a variety of scenarios. Here you can see some of those features applied to a big box type retail park. And on the next slide, applied in a domestic setting with a before and after. And these are just some of the examples of images that we've produced. So next slide. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. I know it's a bit tricky. Thank you. So just briefly to cover why we need rain gardens. In the natural water cycle, as you'll be aware, water continually moves from the earth to the atmosphere and back again. And in doing so, finds its way into our groundwater aquifers, watercourses, and into water bodies, as you can see on the left. In urban areas, development creates impermeable surfaces which interrupts this natural cycle, speeding water into drains, pipes and sewers and canalised watercourses, as you see on the right. And this is further exacerbated by the climate emergency, with changing weather patterns and more rain falling more often, as well as urban creep, which includes infill development, paving over driveways, building extensions, etc., which increase those impermeable surfaces. Next slide. In the UK, as others have mentioned, we also have an antiquated Victorian drainage system, which combines water from properties. such as grey water from washing, such as showers, washing machines, sinks, and foul water from toilets. And this is then combined with rainwater runoff from surfaces such as roads, driveways, and car parks, increasing the volume of water in the sewers, as you see on the left. The increased amount of rain we're experiencing creates peak flows, which the system cannot handle, and results in combined sewer overflows into watercourses, such as those experienced at the River Kelvin. This affects water quality, as well as causes flooding where the system can't cope. So on the next slide, thinking about those slides where we saw the water cycle and the sewage network, we could ask the question of why do we not just install bigger sewer pipes? Why would we bother with a landscape-led solution via rain gardens? The answer to this is that by using those nature-based solutions, you get many additional benefits, as illustrated on this slide here. This shows the 4 pillars of SUDS taken from the Syria SUDS manual, with well-designed rain gardens providing benefits relating to those 4 pillars, so quantity of water, water quality, amenity, and biodiversity. And I think you'll agree, looking at the image there, it's not hard to see how all of those additional benefits are provided by using this green solution, rather than just putting a larger pipe through the city. So on the next slide, as the 4 pillars of SUDS and that example of Sheffield have demonstrated, rain gardens offer a multitude of benefits, not least as part of multifunctional green infrastructure. This is further demonstrated by the work of Glasgow and the Clyde Valley Green Network Partnership and their 2020 publication, Planning for Green Infrastructure, which demonstrates how all of those functions should stack up in the well-designed development. Their guidance provides a suite of exemplar environmental planning policies for green infrastructure and has been used by, amongst others, Western Bartonshire Council in their local development plan too. And you can see there that water management functional policy, so SUDS, managing water, stacks up and provides multitude benefits. So next slide, thank you. So the 10,000 Rain Gardens for Scotland programme's aim is to promote, encourage and deliver rain gardens across Scotland with the ultimate goal of achieving 10,000 by 2030. It was a concept developed initially in 2014 by the Scottish Green Infrastructure Forum and based on examples seen in Portland as well as Melbourne. It was primarily an awareness raising campaign until 2019, at which point we ran a Glasgow pilot project in partnership with Glasgow City Council, Southside Housing Association and NatureScot to test ideas, engage communities and look into challenges. We're now focusing on moving on to the evaluation and monitoring of exemplar rain gardens in a range of situations in Scotland to promote and encourage uptake. And we're also exploring opportunities to deliver retrofitted schemes such as Zetland Park, which you'll see at the end. So just to move on to those 2 case studies which I mentioned. First of all, this is the Glasgow pilot project. As mentioned, the city of Glasgow regularly experiences flooding, current drain and sewer systems struggling to cope with the rainfall it gets. This pilot project, Queensland Court and Gardens in Glasgow, worked with the local community to produce a bespoke rain garden design to help combat this. The scheme has since been awarded a Building with Nature Award, which is where this image on screen is taken from. And there's much more information also on that web link and also on the NatureScot site. I've just got some slides that sort of show some images of the area and the scheme. So if you just pop to the next slide. This shows the Queensland Site in the centre of the image here. There's 2 tower blocks surrounded by amenity space and car parking and bounded by the railway to the north there, roads to the east and south. There's also a culverted burn to the west of the site, which was identified to take residual surface water flow once the SUDS measures were implemented. So the next slide just shows a view of the 2 20-storey blocks, which were actually built in 1965, owned by Southside housing associations. Scotland really is special with the number of housing associations, and it means that there's an opportunity there to contribute to wider green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, just simply due to the land holdings that they hold, as well as linking into their aspirations to provide high quality amenity space for their residents. And this property was situated within one of the flood risk management areas, planning areas. So next slide. The 10,000 Rain Gardens campaign worked to deliver community engagement through a communications campaign with development of leaflets, pop-up events, such as 3 community picnics and workshops with residents. This included hands-on models, as you can see in the images there, to explain rain garden concepts and enable the community to contribute to the design. We also took part in design team meetings and used the site as part of our CSGN forum study visits. Along with there was actually a neighbouring Southside Housing Association property at Moss Heights as well, which was prior to this scheme. So the next slide. The site was taken to detailed design by Rayburn Farquhar Bowen, which is the master plan you see here. And the design includes a series of swales to take runoff, all leading to a basin feature in that top left there. Care was taken with the gradients of the basin and features, as well as to incorporate feedback from community events, which included the channel design of the community rain garden feature, which is in the centre there between the two, and reuse of material on site for play features. If you just quickly flick through the next 2 slides, because it's just images, this shows a visualization. And the next slide, this shows one of those rain garden planters that we had that we installed and worked with the community to plant. And we also had like a mini one on our model, so they were well versed in how this worked. Development of the wider site, I'm afraid, after this was then stalled by COVID. So it's currently, it was sort of at the point of being constructed and it's now on hold, but it will be happening in the future. And just on the final slide of Southside, before I move on to Zetland, just to round up, we were lucky to work with Southside as a very receptive housing association. This was a previous project they'd done at Moss Heights. There's a sort of a before photo on the right and then this photo on the left, sort of as it was just being put in. Those are rain gardens across the top. And then finally, if we just move on to the last set of slides, you can probably just gently scroll through them as I talk. We're currently working on a small scale in Zetland Park in Grangemouth. So yep, keep going, that's fine. Just zooming in there. This is set within the historic Rose Garden. Yeah, and stop on this one, perfect. Which has issues of high water table and water logging. We've been working with Igloo Landscape Architects to develop a rain garden design which creates space for the water on site, therefore enabling rose garden planting within the rose garden. It features a shallow rain garden basin or depression with biodiverse planting, stepping stone crossings and a new rain garden discovery path through the space to allow the visitors to interact with the planting. And this is currently under construction. This is on site at the moment via NRF funding. And then just the final slide, just to say that our campaign website includes leaflets, downloads, and more information on rain gardens, and we encourage you all to visit. This one is taken from our rain garden inbuilt development leaflet. Thank you very much, and sorry about the technical problems. Oh, there's a final slide with context. But yes, thank you.
That was brilliant, Rachel. Thanks very much. And I think, again, sort of learning from a lot of what we've heard from today's speakers, you know, there's so many things that people feel powerless. You know, this is an agenda that everybody can contribute to in terms of their behaviour shift, whether it's getting out of their car or getting involved in a community planting scheme. We would like incredibly edibly Todmorden in Lancashire, where basically the residents of the town just done guerrilla gardening. Every little bit of vacant and derelict green space brownfield sites were just transformed into community horticulture, flowers, just to make the place more attractive. So it's definitely something that schools, community groups, everybody can basically get involved with and do their bit. There's a simplicity in that sort of radical incrementalism, and all of it adds up to the bigger picture. So again, we will at STP will be looking forward to working much more closely with you over the year, Rachel, in terms of getting, particularly in a town and city context, how can we get much more of this infrastructure embedded to liven up our town centres and to actually contribute towards net zero, etc. So thank you so much. In a busy day when you're out doing a real job today, we appreciate that. So thanks for your time and input today. I'm going to start opening up for questions. So we've got a couple of minutes left for questions. If anybody's got any burning comments, I see some stuff coming through chat around reusing cups in terms of coffee shops. Again, people should just be bringing their own cups with them by now. We're going to see.
While you're reading through, keep an eye on the chat. I just want to say that Scotland Loves Local has actually funded a next rain garden scheme in the town of Leven. It's part of the Leven programme. So it's been match funding for a couple of the grant applications that we've got in, but we're really hoping that the next thing will be precisely that. We'll be able to do as a town centre rain garden, developing it up with the local community and seeing how that goes. So.
Okay, let me just see. People talking about litter again. You know, Glasgow, Scotland voted the world's most beautiful country a few years ago, and it's definitely still a persistent problem in terms of people's attitude towards litter. You know, we are pretty lazy and dirty when it comes towards that. But we do have one particular, I think we'll just take this one question before we wrap up. We've got a question for Julie, if she's still there, from Faye Young, which starts off, hooray. So basically, well done, Julie, in terms of your approach. And Faye's question is, how quickly can Edinburgh start working with residents to adopt, to reduce the space for cars, etc., to start thinking? So is that within the greater plans in terms of Edinburgh City Council? How quickly will you be able to sort of start incentivising residents to pick up this agenda? Over to you, Julie.
Well, it's all sort of happening now, if you like. So the no emission zone's just gone through the system as well. So that's gone through the committee. So I think that's sort of that has woken people up to this as obviously more than it was previously. And there's lots of peoples for places, cycle routes that are put in temporarily, and they're either being confirmed or not. And as part of the Craigleith retrofit master plan, all that's going to be taken into consideration. So when they're looking as to which roads, so for example, there'll be certain roads that will basically changing into rain gardens, and making sure that that water, which is currently all underground, comes above ground into these rain garden systems and then is held in the parks. So I think it's at concept design now, and it's moving quickly. And the second place we are moving, so we're having our first workshop for the Morningside, which is quite a large area. So that's going to probably be in the next month or so. So it really is moving at a pace. The greatest problem is resourcing the early stages, because of there's a lot of money out there for building. There is money out there for building them. If you say, here's my plan, here's my rain garden, I want to build it here, so the Nature Restoration Fund or whatever. But when it comes to where should you put that rain garden, the funding is very difficult, because there's not funding. I find it really hard to get funding for that stage of the project, because people want to build stuff. But my point is, you shouldn't just go and build it. You should build it in a logical, strategic. You should think it through. You want to build it in the best place and get the best for it. But there's quite difficult to get that to get money for resources to do that piece of work. So, but it is all all guns blazing. Yeah, there is far too much work, and always struggling with resources. So that's probably where we are. But yeah, definitely moving forward at speed is what I would say.
Okay, thanks, Julie. And I would just like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers today. We've got contact details, we've got copy slides, which will be distributed to all of the delegates this afternoon, and you can pass those on to your colleagues. I think the message is, this is an agenda that's going to be moving at a much faster pace than we've been used to before. It's something that's critical in terms of what we have to do, but it's also an opportunity, a massive opportunity to make places more beautiful, as Julie says, whilst mitigating against climate emergency, and driving all those other collateral benefits of people being healthier and happier. And there's no argument against any of that. So we really do need to be creative, and we need to force as much of this agenda through as quickly as possible, and do it in a really energetic and creative way, because at the end of the day, the health benefits, the air quality benefits, the economic benefits totally outweigh the old system and what we've been doing to damage in terms of car dependency and inclusivity. You know, this is a real point in time where there's lots of resource going towards our town and city centres. The post-pandemic net zero landscape gives us a massive opportunity to do things a lot better. And this is certainly an area of key learning that we need to embrace the experts moving forward to get much more of this embedded in our thinking and design, etc. So without further ado, I'm just going to thank everybody for their contribution. Our next Our next TCAP, so it'll be TCAP 5, is going to be next month, and it's going to be on heritage and tourism. So we will be sending out invites in terms of our programme. Please engage if you can, because all of this gets fed back into policy in terms of trying to shape the agenda, reshape the agenda moving forward at pace. So thanks again for all of your time, particularly to all of our speakers today. So you've got 2 minutes back, time for a cigarette break. If you remember to put it in the bin.